So in this video, I want to tell you a bit more about the scandal and about what I saw in those hearings to the statutory inquiry into the scandal. And that will be the last piece in the jigsaw before I then go on to the final part of this series, part 4, where I'll tell you why this thing happened and then why this stuff is relevant to what we teach our students at university, including what we unhelpfully teach them about plagiarism. And I'll connect to psychology too, because there's a bit of psychology that helps us understand what happened, and there's a bit of psychology that gets in the way. Now, this scandal is a fast-moving target. There's an inquiry ongoing. It's just completed phase 4, and phase 5 begins in April 2024. And even though I'm recording this in February, during the break in the inquiry, we're still finding out new stuff almost on a daily basis. The scandal and its cover-up has been so extensive that it's taking a long time to unearth it all, and the corruption is so deep-seated it's proving difficult to put a stop to it. But I'll tell you what I know so far. But first, we do need to talk about the terminology we're using. Sub-postmaster. But before we do, I want to shorten Post Office Limited to POL, just to save time. And it's Pol, not Paul. I'm Paul. Don't confuse Pol with me. I'm definitely not Pol. Hopefully I'm nothing like Pol. But anyway, others can be the judge of that. Now, back to the term sub-postmaster. The clue to one of the problems that gave rise to the scandal is there in the way that they use the term sub-postmasters, because they also use the term sub-postmistress. That's really old-fashioned. Most of us has moved on from using gendered role titles. That's terminology from the past, and it's important to think about the impact the past has on the post office. And that's why I flagged all that historical material in part 2, because as we'll see in part 4, the past seems to be the place where Post Office Limited is stuck. And in our videos, I've been using the term sub-postmaster just to keep it simple. I'm using the term to cover all gender groups, but it's just simpler to say that than sub-postmasters and mistresses, because as well as being sexist, it's a bit of a mouthful. Now, there's actually even worse terminology in use by Pol, and it came out in the inquiry. And it came out that Pol investigators recorded on their files the ethnicity of the sub-postmasters they were investigating. Why they did this, goodness knows, because it's a bit racist. But what is definitely racist is how they did it. They used these categories. Negroid. Now, when Pol were asked about this, they admitted that they used this terminology up until 2008. And it perhaps points to how out of step Pol have been all the way through the scandal, and how out of step they probably are with modern day culture. But at this point, it's probably a good idea to move on from that terminology and more fully define what sub-postmasters are, because we haven't really properly defined that yet. And it's important, because there's important detail there. Sub-postmasters are different to postmasters. Postmasters are the folk who run the large post office branches that you find in big cities. Sub-postmasters are the folk who run the smaller post office branches that you find in small towns, villages and so on, also in the suburbs. Sub-postmasters are not directly employed by Pol. Rather, they're self-employed agents or franchisees of Pol. We have the same sort of setup here in Australia. In the UK, a sub-postmaster typically purchases a post office branch as a franchise business, and they are then licensed by Pol to run that branch as a post office. And the running of these post office branches is based on a corporate business model, very much focused on ensuring the branch is profitable. Before 2011, sub-postmasters were responsible for all the losses in their branch, but only if it was due to their negligence or carelessness. This was written into their contracts. That might explain why Poll was so committed to blaming the sub-postmaster for any reported losses from a post office branch. Poll had to assert a loss was caused by the sub-postmaster, otherwise they couldn't recover the loss, to get the sub-postmaster to pay back the money that supposedly had gone missing. The contract also gave Poll the right to cancel the sub-postmaster's contract with only 3 months' notice, and they didn't have to give a reason for doing so. Now, there was a new contract came into existence in 2011, which changed that to 6 months' notice, but it also made sub-postmasters responsible for losses in their branch, whether it was due to their negligence or not. The Poll no longer had to prove the sub-postmaster was incompetent or dishonest, though Poll still went on to criminalise sub-postmasters regardless of this. Now, those contracts, both the pre-2011 contract and the post-2011 contract, they were non-negotiable. Interestingly, there was a court judgment into those contracts where a judge concluded that because the post office was not a wholly commercial body, that was partly a public body because the government was the sole shareholder, those contracts were not wholly binding, because there's an allowance in non-commercial contracts for what's called good faith, which means there's a greater obligation on both parties in the contract to be honest, open, cooperative, and to work in each other's interest. You don't have that in commercial contracts because each party is out for themselves, because that's capitalism. There is, little obligation to work in anything than your own self-interest in the commercial sector. In contract law, it's called a distinction between commercial contracts and relational contracts, the latter more often applying to people working for public bodies. But that's a different video, and I'm no fancy lawyer. I don't know if you know this, but I'm not a fancy city lawyer, so I'll stop there before I get myself into a muddle. But the point I want to make is that by law, Poll should have acted in good faith towards sub-postmasters, irrespective of what conditions might have been in those contracts. But they didn't. But it also points to how perhaps Poll, even though it was a public corporation, was acting more like a commercial corporation than a public body. Now, let's turn our attention to the Fujitsu Horizon system. So from 1999 onwards, Poll required all post offices to move over to a new centralised IT system called Horizon, which was an electronic point-of-sales accounting system. It was a system designed and run by the Japanese tech giant Fujitsu, and it was all led out of the company's UK headquarters located in Bracknell, England. So there was this new computer system connected up via the internet, with all transactions coming out of each post office branch being fed into this central location in Bracknell. Before then, most post offices were using paper-based tills. Horizon was a major project. It was huge. At the time, there were 14,000 post office branches. So the implementation of this project was massive. It was the biggest IT project outside of the military that had been undertaken in the whole of Europe at that time. So a big system. And with big systems, when they go wrong, they have a big impact. And the Horizon system went wrong right from the start. It had a multitude of bugs, errors, and defects, which meant that when many sub-postmasters did their accounts at the end of the day, their accounts wouldn't balance. The Horizon system would often record a shortfall, sometimes thousands of pounds. It could go to tens of thousands of pounds. Fujitsu knew about the problem, and Poll knew about the problem, But they didn't tell sub-postmasters about the problem. Instead, they insisted that the system was working perfectly well, that no one else was having any problems, and that therefore the shortfalls must have been due to the errors of wrongdoings of the sub-postmasters. Sub-postmasters were told they had to repay those losses immediately, or they couldn't open up their business the next day, or actually they could get kicked out of their business altogether. Worse than that, Paul threatened them with prosecution, to take them to court and charge them for theft. Now, in 2003, Alan Bates, sub-postmaster in Wales, was finding the Horizon system was reporting losses in his branch, and Paul told him he had to make up those losses, and they accused him of theft. And he didn't agree with them. He said, "I'm not paying it back, and I didn't thieve anything." And Paul kicked him out of his post office. He had his contract terminated. But he didn't take it lying down. He decided he would fight back, and he decided the best way to do that was to find others that this had happened to as well. He didn't believe that he was the only one, and he started up a campaign group called Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. He eventually brought together 555 sub-postmasters, who had all gone through this experience. And 555 was enough for them to get some external financial backing so that they could take out a class action lawsuit against Paul, which they won. And this ultimately brought the whole scandal to light.
Be more happy with the judgment from the court. This has been the result of many years' work to achieve justice for over 550 people.
And since then, there's been this slow, churning kind of progress, not really sure you could say it was progress, towards overturning those wrongful convictions and to compensating all the victims of the scandal. But the progress was really slow, hardly moving at all. It was only when Alan's story was told through the TV drama that we're now seeing that accelerate. Because back in 2017, it didn't really capture the public's attention, and the government didn't really just do anything to act on the scandal. There's no pressure coming from the public for them to do anything. But things are moving now, but by any measure, they're still moving really slowly. Now, we're ready at this point to think about why the scandal happened and how psychology can be both helpful and unhelpful to that, but also to bring in that connection to what we teach university students. And there are two things. First, the obvious thing, from the title of these videos. I do go on about it a lot. It's about plagiarism, what we teach our students about plagiarism. But I also want to talk to you about how we teach our students to think critically, because in psychology, at least, we're doing that wrong too, as far as I can tell. And the worry is that we aren't giving our students the tools they need to be able to avoid becoming the bad guys in scandals like this in the future. So all that's coming up in part 4. Thanks for sticking with me up until now. I know it's been a long journey. Hopefully you can make it back to the next part, the final part, where I draw all of this together in my final analysis. Now, I'm going to run off, put that video together for you. So, till then, ta-da.